Here's a guy who thinks he was smacked by God.
So have you ever been slapped by God? Well, this actually happened to me. Not metaphorically, I mean like body slammed by the divine.
I promise you that did not happen.
I know, that sounds completely insane, but hear me out for a second. See, I was in a pretty dark place at the time. I was homeless, I was sleeping in the back of a gym, dealing with depression, the whole 9 yards. And then out of nowhere, this overwhelming presence just showed up. It wasn't just some warm, fuzzy feeling or a voice in my head. It's more like someone who was just bigger than reality walked into the room and was like, all right, that's enough, get up. And I'm not kidding, it changed me overnight.
Given that you were already dealing with psychiatric issues, why would that not be a much more probable explanation than something bigger than reality?
My friends literally started asking me, dude, what happened to you? You're like a different person. Look, I get it. If I walked up to you on the street and said, hey, God slapped me in the face, you'd probably call 911 and get me some help. But here's the thing that got me thinking. Millions, if not billions of people throughout time and around the world have claimed to have an experience with God.
Gee, it's almost like delusions and misperceptions are common human maladies.
That's not just a few random breakdowns. That's actually data, right? Now, does that prove God exists to you? Probably not. But it's convincing for those who go through it.
Not consistently. Lots of people describe experiences like that without coming to believe that they're real.
And if even one of those encounters is the real deal, well, that changes everything.
You say that as though you think that the more hallucinations people have, the higher the chance that one of them might be real. It doesn't work like that.
So that personal experience, well, it opened a door. But what I found when I looked outside that door, that's what we're really here to talk about. Picture this, you walk into the woods, you look around for maybe a minute. You don't see any deer, so you turn around and you walk back out and say, well, I guess deer don't exist. That would be ridiculous, right? But that's honestly what atheism feels like to me.
Then you don't understand atheism. I'm not an atheist merely because I look around and I don't see God. I'm an atheist because I don't understand what a God is even supposed to be. Even if God were a coherent concept, he would be more comparable to Bigfoot than a deer. It's pretty easy to produce a deer carcass. Producing a Bigfoot carcass and a God carcass seem to be comparably difficult.
We got a massive universe with billions of galaxies, dimensions we can't even wrap our heads around, and we've explored maybe 0.0001% of it. And then we're like, yep, definitely no God here.
If I were in the woods and actually saw something that looked exactly like Bigfoot, I would draw the very rational conclusion that it was a guy in a Bigfoot suit, or a bear, or some other kind of misperception. If I saw something that claimed to be God, I would also draw the very rational conclusion that it was some variety of misperception. I'll believe in Bigfoot when someone can show me a Bigfoot carcass that I can thoroughly examine. I'll believe in God when someone can coherently define what God is and show me a God carcass that I can thoroughly examine.
Now I know what you're thinking. Atheism isn't claiming that God doesn't exist, it's just the lack of belief in a God. Okay, but is it though? Because according to Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, atheism actually means the proposition that God does not exist. So you can't just sit on the fence all day with atheism.
Yeah, you can. The definition of atheism used by philosophers is most commonly the one that says that it's the affirmation of the non-existence of God. That's not the only legitimate definition. Over the last few decades, it's become very common to define the term broadly enough to encompass agnosticism. Certainly, it wouldn't make any sense to say that you can't sit on the fence all day with agnosticism.
But fine, let's play that game. Let's just say you lack the belief in God. Okay, cool. Why do you lack that belief?
Because I don't see how it's coherent to say that all of space and time had a creator. In order for something to be created, there has to be a time when it didn't already exist, followed by a time when it does exist. Something can't be created if there was never a time when it didn't already exist. There was obviously never a time when time didn't already exist, therefore it could not have had a creator.
Well, I haven't seen enough evidence. Really? Would you say the same thing about aliens?
Yes, I also don't believe in aliens. However, since there is life on this planet, I am much more inclined to believe it's possible elsewhere. If we can confirm that one God exists, I'll be as open to being convinced of polytheism as I am of aliens.
Would you say you don't believe in aliens because NASA hasn't personally called you? Or do you think, well, there's billions of planets out there, so aliens probably do exist?
I'm not convinced we have enough data to calculate the odds of aliens existing, so I'm agnostic about whether they even probably exist.
What about abiogenesis? You know, life coming from non-life? Do you believe in that? Because if you do, show me the lab where they actually made that happen.
If I were to show you that happening in a lab, you would say, well, the scientists who created it were alive, therefore it doesn't count as life coming from non-life. Scientists have developed single-celled organisms with entirely synthetic genomes, but I suspect you won't think that counts.
Oh yeah, that's right. There isn't one. But it's still the best explanation we got to go with considering the data, right?
Given that all life is made out of chemicals, I think it's pretty likely that the first form of life also came from chemicals.
So here's what I've noticed. Every argument for atheism is actually just an argument against a specific type of God. But I haven't seen any actual arguments for atheism. It's just the assumption that for some reason atheism is the default position.
The definitions of atheism that include agnosticism are the default position. Agnosticism is the default position with respect to any position one has yet to conclusively investigate. If you want an argument for the non-existence of God, I gave one earlier in the video. Space-time, per se, cannot be created and therefore cannot have a creator.
But you're not the neutral baseline here. You got your own belief system with its own assumptions. And if your worldview doesn't offer good arguments and mine does, maybe that's worth exploring. So, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does anything exist at all?
I believe that the universe exists for the same reason you believe God exists. Just as you believe that God is a necessary being, I believe space-time is either necessary or just a brute fact.
Atoms, galaxies, consciousness, my cat, none of it had to exist. We can imagine a universe with nothing, no space, no time, no matter, or at least conceive of it.
I can't. That would be a contradiction. The universe, by definition, is the space-time continuum. Without space-time, there is no universe. Perhaps you use a different definition of universe, but I don't understand what it would mean for anything to exist independent of space-time. What does it mean to exist or to occupy reality if it doesn't mean having location in space-time?
So the real question is reality made of things that could not have existed? Or is there something that must exist no matter what?
Those aren't the only two options. Not everything we can conceive of is possible. It may be the case that the total non-existence of all space-time is conceivable, but not possible. I'm not sure it's even conceivable, though.
That's the heart of the contingency argument. A contingent thing is something that doesn't exist by necessity, like your phone or you or the whole universe. A necessary thing has to exist. It can't not exist. So here's how the argument builds. Something exists. But if everything was contingent, there'd be no ultimate explanation. And that doesn't sit right.
Well, to paraphrase Neil deGrasse Tyson, the universe is under no obligation to sit right with you. A universe that exists as a simple brute fact makes a lot more sense to me than something which has never not existed having a creator.
We expect explanations, always. That's the principle of sufficient reason. So not everything can be contingent.
Not everything can be contingent just because we expect something not to be? How does that logically follow?
Which means there must be something that's necessary. A foundation. You don't walk outside, see a dent in your car, and say, well, probably nothing did that. You assume a cause, you go looking. And maybe you say, okay, but what if there's just an infinite chain of explanations? Well, that doesn't solve it.
Why not? As Bertrand Russell says, there's no logical problem with a series with no first term, so in principle, I don't think there's necessarily a problem with an infinite regress of explanations. I don't think there is an infinite chain of explanations, though. I don't think the existence of space-time can have an explanation, let alone needs one.
An eternal forest still needs a reason for that forest to exist at all. You need an explanation for the totality of contingent things. This whole chain of reality points back to something that doesn't depend on anything else. Something necessary that's absolutely independent.
Sounds like space-time to me.
And the question is, could that be God?
If you're a pantheist, yeah.
The universe doesn't just exist. It exists in a very specific way, fine-tuned down to absurdly precise values, perfectly calibrated to allow life.
Ironically, it is only the case that other parameters would not permit life if there is no God. If there is an all-powerful God, then any set of parameters would allow life because God would have the power to put life into a universe with any set of parameters. In fact, earlier in the video, this guy mentioned that nobody's ever seen life coming from non-life. If life can't come from non-life, but can come from God, then God must be a living being. Clearly, this dude doesn't believe that God requires a finely tuned universe in order to exist, or any universe at all. Since that's the case, life per se is not contingent upon any set of parameters.
So imagine that this mixer here is the universe. Every knob here controls a fundamental constant of physics. This right here is the gravitational constant. Turn it up a hair, stars burn out too fast. Turn it down, no stars at all. This one right here is the strong nuclear force. Slightly higher, no hydrogen, no water. Slightly lower, no carbon, no chemistry, no you.
Gee, it's almost like life is a product of chemistry.
This right here is the cosmological constant, the energy of empty space, tuned into 1 part in 10 to the power of 120. That's like tossing a dart across the universe and hitting a single atom.
It would be if we had any reason to believe that this value could have been different. That's another problem with the fine-tuning argument. It assumes that just because we can imagine these values being different, that means that they actually could have been.
And there are dozens of these. the electron charge, proton mass, expansion rate, all exactly where it needs to be. You change any one of them just a slight amount and everything starts to collapse in on itself. We have no universe as we know it. If you think that's luck, that's like walking into a studio, seeing a perfect mix and assuming the knobs just happen to land that way.
There are no knobs that can dial in the constants of the universe.
Contingency tells us that something must exist. Fine-tuning tells us that it must be precise. Put those together, you don't get randomness, you get design.
What if the thing that must exist is the values of the parameters you assume are variable?
And now that we've seen what this necessary mind must look like, let's ask, how did it reveal itself?
I don't understand what it means for a mind to exist independent of time, space, and matter.
And that brings us to Jesus. So back in part 2, I said this. Sometimes the best explanation is the one that has the most explanatory power, just like with abiogenesis. People don't demand certainty, they demand coherence. They want a framework that fits the evidence. Now we're going to apply that principle to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If I could show you the best explanation for what we see in the Gospels is that Jesus actually rose from the dead, well then you got two options. You can either engage with it and try to refute the data with a stronger model, or you could just say, God not real though.
Or you could point out the fact that even if Jesus did rise from the grave, it would be a whole-ass non sequitur to infer that he was therefore God. Or as Christopher Hitchens put it,
nor, if I was to see him executed one day and see him walking the streets the next, would that show that his father was God, or his mother was a virgin, or that his teachings were true, especially given the commonplace nature of resurrection at that time and place. After all, Lazarus was raised, never said a word about it. The daughter of Jairus was raised, didn't say a thing about what she'd been through. And the Gospels tell us that at the time of the crucifixion, all the graves in Jerusalem opened and their occupants wandered around the streets to greet. So that it seems the resurrection was something of a banality at the time. Not all of those people clearly were divinely conceived. So I'll give you all the miracles and you'll still be left exactly where you are now, holding an empty sack.
Let's start with the sources. The reliability of the New Testament. Quick disclaimer, this isn't the New Testament is reliable, so therefore Jesus rose. This is the New Testament is reliable, so we actually know what the eyewitnesses claimed.
we don't have adequate reason to believe that the accounts were written by eyewitnesses or even quoted eyewitnesses, let alone did so reliably.
Now we can evaluate the claim on historical grounds like any other event. First of all, the Gospels weren't anonymous. Every early manuscript that we have that should contain the author's names has the author's names.
They have the names of figures that Irenaeus and Papias inferred were the authors. We don't know that they were the authors, and we have good reason to believe that they weren't, given that they were unlikely to have the level of literacy necessary to write the Gospels. Also, if I write a story and don't explicitly state in the text that I am the author, that text is still anonymous even if I write myself into the story.
No mystery copies, no PR spins. And the writings, it fits the authors. Matthew talks money, John knows the land, Luke drops medical terms, and Mark sounds just like Peter.
The evidence that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark is that it sounds like it was written by Peter?
Luke literally opens with, many have undertaken. I investigated everything carefully from the beginning. And in Acts, he switches to we. Luke was there recording the eyewitnesses. And scholars agree that the same author that wrote Luke is the same author that wrote Acts. The tone, the vocabulary match Greco-Roman historians. Guys like Demosthenes, and I know I didn't say that right. Luke isn't writing mythology, he's writing history.
He's not really writing either. A gospel doesn't really fit into either of those genres.
Classical historian Colin Hemmer found 84 confirmed historical details in Acts. Not theology, not symbolism, just raw accuracy.
If you read War and Peace, you will find many accurate historical details in that book as well. That isn't evidence that Pierre Bezukhov was a real guy, or that Tolstoy was an eyewitness to the things he said or did, or that he was writing history or mythology.
Different Jewish communities had different naming patterns, and the New Testament nails these naming patterns, unlike Gospels that we know are forgeries, like the Gospel of Judas.
But the presence of such detail is poor evidence that the stories are true.
The Gospel of Judas misses the names, gets the geography wrong, and gets the tone wrong.
The Gospels get several things wrong as well. Perhaps they don't get as much wrong as the documents that are not considered canonical, but they do have their mistakes. A famous example is that one passage says that Jesus was born when Quirinius was governor of Syria, while another says that he was born when Herod was still alive. Since these periods didn't overlap, the two passages can't both be true. Apologists have to tie themselves into knots to explain this away, like saying that when the Bible says governor of Syria, it actually meant something else. They can't accept the much more probable explanation that the author just got something wrong.
It reads like a fanfic from 150 years later, because it is. So no, this doesn't prove the resurrection, but it does prove this. We're working with real voices. Eyewitness level claims.
No, we do not have sufficient reason to believe that they are eyewitness level claims.
From people who believed what they saw. And they claim that they saw him get beaten. They saw him get crucified. They saw him get killed and get buried. And then 3 days later, they say that they saw him again.
Since we don't know who wrote the Gospels, we have little reason to infer that the claims made therein were made by reliable witnesses. The very fact that they claim to have seen a guy rise from the dead undermines their credibility.
And they didn't say it quietly. They either were willing or they did die for that claim.
We have absolutely no reason whatsoever to believe that they died or were willing to die specifically for the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. They were followers of a guy who tried to overthrow the Roman occupation of Judea. That's enough of a reason for the Romans to martyr them even if they didn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead.
We're not dealing with legends or handed down whispers. We're dealing with public, early, consistent claims.
Given that the vast majority of people who would have witnessed what the Gospels claim would have been illiterate, it is unlikely that the Gospels were not handed down to people who were literate. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.